Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming this evening. No one got stuck in the traffic. That's great, isn't it? I'm Peter Mears. Welcome to this evening's discussion, Moving and Shaping Melbourne. The artwork used to promote this event by Dean Bowen is called Suburbanology. It's 20 years old, and I think it speaks to an even earlier time, perhaps nostalgically, when the idea of the car and the suburb fitted together like hand and glove. An optimistic time. The driver is whistling in the picture. The family's happy. The traffic flows but doesn't dominate. These days, the roads on the tapestry would be a lot more crowded. The cars might not be moving at all, and the drivers would probably be looking frustrated. In preparing for tonight's event, I looked up some data on the Victorian Government's Transport Statistics portal, comparing Melbourne with two other cities that also have trains, trams and buses, the two cities, Toronto and Berlin. Very different cities, but some things in common. And the figures were telling. On average, Melburnians travel more than 8,000 kilometres per year in private cars. That's more than 1.5 times the distance driven each year by residents of Toronto and more than double the distance driven each year by Berliners. Public transport figures run in the opposite direction, with Berliners travelling double the distance on public transport that Melburnians travel. If we look at that continuum of cities, I think it's probably fair to say that we'd like to see Melbourne move along the continuum. There's a widely shared aim that Melbourne should transition towards being more like Toronto and eventually Berlin, a city in which a larger proportion of daily trips are made by public transport, walking and cycling. But as the old joke goes, if you're trying to go there, I wouldn't start from here. In other words, if you want a city with high rates of public transport use, it's pretty difficult to get it when you begin with a city that is heavily car dependent. Yet we all know the business as usual model of cars being the primary mode of transport in Melbourne can't continue, particularly as we head to a population of 7 million in coming decades. VicRoads certainly knows this, and the organisation has been a prime mover in getting this event off the ground as it seeks to generate debate prior to broader public consultations around its road use strategy. So to get us underway this evening, I'd like to introduce David Shelton, VicRoads Executive Director of Strategy and Planning and Road Safety Coordinator, to outline the challenges facing transport in Melbourne. David Shelton.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the City of Melbourne for organising our discussion. So why is VicRoads leading this discussion? VicRoads is changing, quite simply, and we're changing because our community is demanding that we change. In recent surveying, Melburnians are telling us that their greatest concerns for future transport planning is the need to expand public transport services and to deal with traffic. 45% of people and 45% of people are telling us that, in fact, if we improved infrastructure, they would cycle more. We're getting the same message around walking. And the majority of Melburnians understand that improving capacity on existing roads is at least as important or more important than building new roads. We believe that we need to have a discussion about this, and we accept that the change involves VicRoads changing. So how is Melbourne changing? I'm going to refer to inner, middle and outer Melbourne quite a bit as we go. Inner is essentially the 5 councils right here in the city. We then have another 13 councils around there being our middle area, and then the outer area largely including our growth areas. Our population distribution across Melbourne is 10% in the inner part of Melbourne, 40% in the middle and 50% in the outer. Between now and 2051, the forecast is that this population will increase from 4.3 million to 7.8 million. There's a lot of land being released in the outer parts of Melbourne to accommodate this, but there's also very significant opportunities for development in inner and middle Melbourne. It'll ultimately be markets that'll determine where that population goes. The jobs distribution is a little bit different. We're pretty much 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 inner, middle and outer with our distribution of jobs through Melbourne. Jobs growth in inner Melbourne is projected to continue. and growing jobs in our middle and outer suburban activity centres is one of the greatest challenges that we face. Access to jobs, however, is quite unequal, as travel choices are not evenly distributed throughout Melbourne. They depend on the road system, they depend on the public transport services, and they depend on land use patterns. The outer suburbs, especially our growth areas, are very dispersed employment services, with high frequency of public transport really being focused in the inner part of Melbourne. For every 18 jobs that a resident of inner Melbourne can access within a 45-minute commute, a resident in outer Melbourne can access just one. So let's talk about how our roads are performing. Over the last decade, we've put on about 20% of population in Melbourne, 20% increase in population. That has actually come with a 16% increase in vehicle kilometres travelled across our road network, and a massive 30% increase in growth state product. Nearly all of that increase in vehicle kilometres travelled has occurred on our freeways and in outer Melbourne. We've achieved this with just a 4% increase in lane kilometres being added to that road network. In productivity terms, this is what we call sweating the asset. But demand for travel is increasing, and we're actually adding about 1,800 people a week to our population. On average, Melburnians travel 3.1 trips every day. This means another 2 million trips being added each year. In total, Melburnians travel 13.4 million trips every day. Of these, the journey to work is again split about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, with destinations in inner, middle and outer Melbourne. For the whole of the city, the journey to work trips are 75% made by car. 17% public transport, 4% walking, 2% by bike. In inner Melbourne, the largest mode share remains the car at 48%. Secondly, we have public transport at 42%. And then when we go to middle Melbourne, we find that public transport mode share drops from 42 to just 7%. From inner to middle, 42% down to 7%. The use of the car jumps dramatically, and without no surprise that by the time you get to outer Melbourne, you're at 3% public transport mode share. Beyond the working week, our traffic volumes midday on average weekdays are now higher than the midday traffic volumes during the midweek. On the supply side, public transport usage has been rising dramatically. That is a terrific thing to see. We've got an 8.3% annual increase in patronage on our trains, 4.4% increase on our trams, and 3.7% on buses. But 85% of that public transport kilometres is done on roads and generally in traffic. 85% of public transport kilometres on roads, generally in mixed traffic. As I say, we haven't been adding much in the way of lane kilometres. In fact, that's been flattening out, so we haven't been matching that demand. The result is actually an increase in our peak periods, not surprisingly. By 6:30 in the morning, most of our freeways are carrying an 80% of their peak volume, and what we once saw as being a peak hour in the afternoon now takes about 3 hours. That trend is accentuated by our shift to a service economy as it pushes more and more traffic into the middle of the day for short trips, particularly for light commercial vehicles. By 2051, Melburnians are forecast to be adding another 10 million trips a day over what we currently have. Roads already dominate our landscape, our urban landscape, and there's little appetite to add more. The outer suburbs are arguably an exception to that. On the cycling and walking front, we've been increasing cycling by about 6% a year. Walking's also increasing quite strongly, but there's enormous potential for this to increase even further. In 2009, our survey data tells us that 55% of all trips across Melbourne were for distances of less than 5 kilometres. 55% of all trips less than 5 kilometres. For shopping trips, that rises to 72%. Huge opportunity, particularly for cycling, but also for walking. So our challenges really are, what sort of a future do we see for our road system in Melbourne? We see excessive sharing of arterial roads compromising both the efficiency of our transport system and also reducing the livability through which those roads actually move. Tram speeds are slowing each year. Average peak hour tram speeds are now at around 15 kilometres for an hour. In inner Melbourne, roads take up something like 23% of the urban area, so congested roads mean congested spaces, congested living areas. Melbourne's iconic places, such as our strip shopping centres, are really being impacted by traffic. Night times are being impacted by noise, particularly as trucks move into those periods. And so let's turn to our responses. Firstly, our places across Melbourne. Our places arguably make Melbourne, but places shape transport. Transport is really what links our places together, and so that shapes our transport. In turn, our transport's actually shaping our places, often negatively. So we need to clearly define which are our important places, how do we protect them, which are our important links, how do we ensure that they work efficiently, and that's going to involve some trade-offs as our population increases and our travel demand grows as well. In terms of our links, we certainly see a desperate need for greater hierarchy within our arterial system in Melbourne. Clearly our freeways are the highest order of road for movement of traffic in Melbourne, but underneath that we find our arterials are really trying to do everything for everybody all of the time. That greatly compromises their transport efficiency, and in many instances it's also compromising the livability of the places they go through. To do that, we need to identify which are our principal networks for each mode so that we can actually operate our system to favour those things. So where do we want our trucks? Let's design the network in those locations for trucks. Where do we want our public transport? Let's get things out of the way to allow our public transport to work well in those locations. And so on. Traffic needs a clear network that provides the backbone for traffic movement. It allows us to do a couple of things there. It allows us to, in fact, focus on the impacts of traffic and minimise those. At the moment, traffic actually filters through much of our urban environment and has a very broad and dispersed impact. You can manage that to a point, but as trips actually grow and grow, that becomes even more and more challenging. And perhaps most importantly for middle Melbourne, we need to sort out our on-road public transport. I mentioned earlier 85% of that's currently on-road in mixed traffic. Our tram network needs to move increasingly towards a light rail system rather than the current system. A light rail system would see our trams in their own dedicated right-of-way, and it would allow them to operate much more efficiently and give you a really turn-up-and-go public transport system, which is what a modern city needs. And finally, the right mode for the task. We utilise cars and trams and buses for a lot of things that we could be using walking and cycling for. I mentioned some of those figures earlier. We do a large proportion of very short trips. Walking and cycling not only reduces some of the congestion on our roads, but it has obvious health and amenity and livability benefits. There's a great underutilisation there that we need to design much better for. So finally, I pose the question, are we paying too high a price for our car dependency? What sorts of trade-offs might we need to make if we wanted to address that, and over what time period might we do that? But ultimately, the question is, what sort of a city do we want? Because our roads are a principal part of that. Thank you. Shall I go?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And I'll invite our other panellists now to come and join David up on the comfy chairs so that we can get some responses. And I'll introduce them to you as they come up. Paul Donegan is a fellow at the Grattan Institute, where he's worked on the cities program for the past 2 years, and he's the co-author of Grattan's new book, City Limits, which is available for sale at the back of the hall. and has a lot to say about transport, among other issues. Jennifer Cunich is the Executive Director of the Victorian Division of the Property Council of Australia, so very concerned and interested in the way in which urban development happens and the shape of the city and what sort of city it is. William McDougall is an independent transport planner, engineer and economist. He has many years' experience consulting both to the public and the private sector on transport issues. And Dr. John Stone is a lecturer in transport planning at the University of Melbourne. And John has been looking at what Australian cities can learn about effective and efficient public transport from their counterparts in German-speaking countries. So please join me in making them welcome. Okay, and I'm going to invite, before I open up for a conversation, I'm going to invite each of them to give a brief response to what we've heard from David Shelton at VicRoads. And there were some pretty strong statements in there. I mean, essentially saying we've got to prioritise what we do with our roads. They can't be all things to all people anymore. We've got to decide, we've got to make more room for trams to operate like light rail without not being held up by cars, etc. So some pretty big changes foreshadowed ahead. Paul Donegan, do you want to kick off?
Thank you, and thanks David for a terrific presentation that, as you identified, there are some hard trade-offs here and the community needs to be a part of owning those trade-offs, and so it's great that VicRoads are doing an event like this. It's worth reflecting upon what are some of the things we need from a city. Two of the most important are somewhere to live and somewhere to earn a living, typically a job. So the transport system's role in many respects is to connect us between where we live and where we work and other things that are important to us in our lives, social activity, shopping, education and so forth. What we're seeing though, and David touched upon, is a big and growing divide between population growth and employment growth. So that means we're actually asking the transport system to do more and more to bridge this divide because of the way our city is growing. So I'd ask us all to bear in mind that there are many things you can do to ease the pressures on the transport network, and one very important thing is giving people more opportunities to make choices about where they live, including to live closer to employment opportunities. However, as Peter said, we've got to take the city as it is, not as we might like it to be. And to that end, there are many important things you can do to improve the transport network. Obviously, expanding access, and you've touched upon public transport, is critically important, and others may speak further on this. But there are very limited funds that we have available. Roads, train lines are very expensive. So I'd just like to put a few things on the table, potentially somewhat provocative or controversial, about how we can enable our public transport and our road systems to do a whole lot more. Because if you take an existing network and if you take its role to be connecting people and jobs and other things, then if you're able to get a whole lot more connections out of the same network, then that's a very good thing. One of them was gently touched upon was enabling buses and trams to run in dedicated lanes. Where that's done well, that enables a whole lot more throughput of people going where they'd like to go. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is a really useful example. The one bus lane on that bridge carries more people to the Sydney CBD than all the inbound car lanes combined. Another though is, that's one tool you can use. Similarly, clearways have a lot of potential to enable more people to get to where they're going, using the roads as a means of connecting people rather than a means of parking. Obviously, that's something that's not particularly welcomed by street traders in an area, so we need to have that conversation. But if we're serious about tackling congestion and so forth, getting the most out of available road space needs to be part of that discussion. And similarly, and potentially more controversially, you can get a whole lot more out of existing roads, train lines in particular, and put off having to purchase new and expensive infrastructure by using pricing to shape how those roads and those train lines get used. In particular, making off-peak service a higher price than, peak services higher priced than off-peak services, can make a difference in how people choose to use those roads and those train lines, and enable us to get more people on the road and on the train over the course of a day. So perhaps I'll hand over to Jennifer now, but those are some ideas for consideration.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I think we have some strong ideas on the table there already. The idea of road user charging, congestion charging, or time of day pricing on both roads and perhaps also on public transport. That example of the one bus lane on the Sydney Harbour Bridge carrying more people into the CBD than all the car lanes combined, I've always wondered about the Westgate. There's no bus lane on the Westgate, but I'll leave that for later discussion. Jennifer.
Well, I think there are many things that you raised in your presentation that the Property Council would absolutely support. There's lots of issues to discuss here. We're very keen to see development take place along and around transport nodes so that we can better use the current public transport network that we have. Obviously, it needs to continue to be upgraded, and we need to monitor how we're going to deal with the growth, the population growth of the city. So there's opportunities, as you pointed out, in that middle ring. The real challenge is the outer urban growth areas, and the infrastructure just simply isn't there in the first instance. So while we continue to grow and we don't accommodate this growth in the inner and middle ring that has the capacity to do so through its public transport system, we're putting enormous pressure in the urban growth areas. So that needs to be addressed. I think that, and having said that, there are transport corridors that are far better suited to take some of this medium density than there are others. So working with local councils and understanding where that can take place is very important. I think the buses are underutilised in Melbourne. We're very much a train and tram city, or a car city. I know it's incredibly frustrating when people get on a bus to get to the train station to find the train's left 5 minutes before the bus actually arrived. So I would think simple sequencing might assist a little bit. And I understand that the Bus Association is working towards this, but there's an enormous opportunity to get an orbital system working, linking up trams and trains so that we actually get movement across the city rather than this sort of arterial transport system that we have. The hierarchy, I think, is very important. Not everything's going to move onto rail. We do have a freight network that we need to cater for. We need to complete the outer ring, the M80, and the outer ring so we can get trucks off the suburban roads. We need to move them. Great, fan. So that's really important that's considered, and getting quite dangerous trucks off suburban streets, I think, should be a priority. But all in all, I think the presentation that you've given is very encouraging.
Can I just pick up on one thing you've said there, Jennifer, which, and I think it fits with Paul's work and the Grattan Institute's work, and that is the idea that you would actually increase the housing options available in the middle ring suburbs. So that, and your suggestion is, I think you talked about doing it along transport corridors. So where you had, say, a solid tram line going along a road, you'd see more people living along that road, building up height along the road, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and we're not talking high rise. We're talking a sort of a low medium density, what's appropriate in a particular area, to utilise the current systems around train stations. So better utilising the infrastructure already existing around train stations. Of course, there's going to need to be money spent on upgrading and more trains. But if you make it easy for people to be able to get to the train or the tram, they're going to use it. Nobody really wants to sit in a car for 45 minutes, which should when they can sit on a train for 15. And
Paul, you might want to comment on this too before I come to other speakers. But how big a difference could that make in terms of population? Because you think, oh yeah, so we can have a few more people living on Nicholson Street or whatever, but is it really going to accommodate the sort of population we're talking about moving to Melbourne? Is there enough room? And is it going to make those places unlivable?
You can certainly do it in a way that enables substantial population growth in areas without radical shifts to the amenity of those areas. If you think about something like a granny flat, that's actually double the density of an area with no it's a flippant kind of remark, but there's the kinds of changes involved need not be too intense, as Jennifer has touched upon, and in many respects, the kind of livability of an area is contingent on a whole range of factors. The number of people in them is only one. If they're all on the road, that's a big problem. But if you're taking advantage of existing public transport networks and making them even more viable, then it can actually have a positive impact on an area.
Did you want to add to that, Jennifer?
I agree. And as I said, there are certain transport corridors that perhaps aren't best to cope with some density, but there are flow-on benefits if it's done well and it's in keeping with the existing character of an area, where you get vibrancy on streetscapes, you get cafes, appearing, you get a safety, issue is dealt with. So there are many benefits for really well-developed activity around this.
So we could, if we look at Melbourne, South Yarra is one of the densest but also one of the most popular suburbs. So density and amenity don't necessarily counteract each other. So we could see potentially David's idea of trams being given priority, being more like light rail, going together with greater moving up to more levels, say 3 or 4 medium rise along those transport corridors. Okay, I'm trying to think in as practical terms as I can as we go along. So, William McDougall, I invite you to respond now to what we've heard so far.
Thank you very much, Peter, and previous speakers, and thanks, David, for your presentation. When I'm sitting here listening to this, one of the thoughts in my head is that we've been talking like this for a very long time. Years and years. I've built a whole career on it myself. But and I think we always try and think that we've got some new solution, something new that's going to come along in this space and change things for us. And change is gradual, that's for sure. But I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening right now that we need to start planning for and incorporating in our thinking in a big way. And they're things which are going to change the landscape of transport, and some are going to change it in a good way, some in a bad way. It's important, though, that we embrace these things. A lot of them are new technologies. I'm talking about things like autonomous vehicles.
That's a driverless vehicle, self-driving cars?
Or self-driving car, yep. What we've seen in development of car clubs, the Go Get and other things, and Uber as alternatives, rattling the bars of the taxi industry. Thinking about new ways that people are going to find, are going to choose to get around, really to try and overcome some of the limitations of what's available to them outside those things. And certainly the motor industry, through self-driving cars and other things, is making a lot of effort to make sure that we still actually do use automobiles in some form or another. But I think the patterns and the things that we've used as the basis of our forecasting, modelling and predicting the future and so on, such as car ownership continuing to grow, I think car ownership is going to change very, very significantly by some of these things. We're more likely to want to dial up something that will come and take us where we need to go, and then go off and do that for someone else when it's served our purpose, rather than have our own car that we lovingly care for. Some of us. I love cars. I love my cars. But these are the sort of things that I think are going to change the way we need to think about transport and moving around. They're going to impact on freight and people movement, and automation. Things like 3D printing is going to change the way a lot of things are actually made and distributed. No one's really thinking about that yet in a serious way, in a way of how it's going to impact on the planning of the city. I think the technology that's starting to impinge and new technologies and enhanced technologies that are going to impinge on the modes of transport and how efficient they are, traffic signals, moving block signalling for trains, and all sorts of other things which are going to increase the capacity of the system overall. Bear in mind that our roads, although Dave mentioned lane kilometres, the road system its capacity is dictated by the number of traffic signals and how much traffic you can get through those. And the focus on removing level crossings will allow more trains to run without interrupting more cars. But I hesitate to say it's going to make an enormous difference to the traffic volume, the traffic flows, because just down the road from most of those level crossings, there's a traffic signal somewhere. And many of them haven't been looked at for a long time. There's an enormous number of them, thousands and thousands of them around Melbourne, and VicRoads can't get to look at them all and reset them all and adjust them and look at areas and so on fast enough, I don't think. Some of them don't get looked at for 20 years, and they may be still on the same settings that were put in when they were first built. But the traffic has changed enormously. The relative flows on different arms of each roundabout, each junction has changed. And I think roundabouts was the next thing I was going to mention. We might need to make more use of them. Australians don't like using roundabouts because there aren't many of them around. But a traffic signal system, just at some point at any traffic signal, all the traffic is stopped while everything clears so the next lot can go. Roundabouts, so long as the flows are equal on all the roads, in and out of them, would probably provide more capacity and a smoother flow. But, there again, should we be really chasing down and reducing congestion on the road system in this way? Maybe we should, as David said, focus more on getting the higher capacity modes of transport and the less environmentally damaging modes of transport, like walking, cycling and public transport in particular, moving faster and carrying more people. And I think for public transport that means we've got to just simply provide a lot more of it. We can get the trams running more segregated, and we certainly need more buses as well, but I think we need a dramatic increase in the capacity of our rail system, because that's going to do the heavy lifting of the day-to-day journey to work for most people, and that's probably the economy is going to be more and more impacted on by how much we can increase public transport to take the load off or to allow further growth which can't be carried on the roads. Finally, I think just one last point is that, which is close to my heart and probably everybody's, is that as long as the process that all of this happens through is a political one, all that seems to do is really delay proper progress, and it also, I think, means that the wrong things get done because political priorities don't often match real needs, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thanks, William. So technology will make a difference. Smart signalling, sequencing of traffic lights, bring back the old, more roundabouts, but we're also going to need more investment in infrastructure, roads, and all the things David said about separating trams and buses and so on. So John Stone, your turn.
Thanks, Peter. Now, there's a lot of things that I could respond to in everybody's presentation, and maybe we can get to that if people want to follow that up in the question time. But I thought what I'd like to contribute is some perspectives from transport policy and transport planning practice in other places which have made a really big difference. One of the really important things, and Dave mentioned it, is how do we decide what city we want, what process we want? William seems to be throwing up his hands at the political process, but we don't really have any other ways of making decisions except the political process. And where cities have done this, where they have, instead of for VicRoads having to read the tea leaves and try and put together all these different priorities from a random collection of different state planning documents, we need a process which actually says, what mode share do we want? What city do we want? And then we can say, well, we want this many people travelling by public transport, this many people travelling by road, and then we can start allocating capacity instead of trying to work out, well, let's try and maximise the roads, the cars here and the public transport there. And when we have that sort of framework, and that sort of framework where it's been done successfully has been driven by well-organised community discussion, debate, the things that allowed us to stop the ridiculous East-West link and be able to now have a situation where we can think a little bit more sensibly about transport policy. That was done because, unlike any other time in transport planning in the last 20 years, we had a really well-organised community participating in that debate. And if that goes forward to discuss how do we improve public transport, I think we're going to be in a better position. But from there, then we start getting into some technical areas of transport planning, and one of the important ones there is what's the role of congestion? And I think Dave's touched on that congestion is a tool that we use to move people from one mode to another. If we just take public transport and roads, the relative speeds of the two systems is what drives people choosing one over the other. So if you speed up the public transport system, you reduce car traffic and vice versa. So how do we use congestion well, and where do we have the congested cars so they don't get in the way of the public transport system? The systems in many cities in German-speaking Europe have systems with their traffic lights where you get to congestion, but it's in the suburbs. When you finally get onto the streets in the inner city where the public transport is king, then there's very few cars because only a few of them have been let in, and so it's much easier to give them priority. So the people waiting in the queues are waiting somewhere away from the cars. So that's something we need that's what our traffic signals can do for us. Then we need to think about what we do with the public transport system, and it's not just a matter of making the tram go faster on Nicholson Street or wherever it is, it's how do all those pieces fit together so that more people can move around using the system. So the networks are what makes public transport become economically efficient. It's how you get better ridership. Instead of trying to link every destination with every origin, you actually have nodes where people transfer, and those, if they work well, then your public transport can be efficient. And so looking at Jennifer's organisation's website today and noticing that they had a proposal for $500 million of outer suburban arterial road expansion. Well, I think if they're following the logic that we're following tonight, rather than arterial road expansion, they should be saying, yes, let's spend money in the outer suburbs, but let's do it on improving people's access, because that's what is really important. And in some cases that might be small pieces of road infrastructure, but mostly it's going to be about making the public transport system provide an alternative. And the last thing I just wanted to talk about now is to think about what we do with the I'll come back to that point.
Thanks, John. Look, I'm going to engage the panel in a bit of conversation now, and then I'm going to invite you to ask questions if you have questions. There are a couple of microphones I'll point out to you in a moment. But just taking what you've said, John, and the question of the outer suburbs, because we're probably an inner city dominated audience, I'm guessing, here tonight, and we're here in the heart of the city. But in fact, in Paul's book, it talks about how jobs growth has been highest in the inner city in a high knowledge economy and things like that. But there's still an awful lot of jobs in the outer suburbs and awful lot of people moving across suburbs, not in and out of the city centre. And 9/10 of commutes to jobs more than 10 kilometres, 9 out of 10 commutes to jobs more than 10 kilometres from the centre of Melbourne are by car. And in Paul's book, there's an example of a woman who lives in Epping North and works in Blackburn. You wouldn't want to try and do that by public transport, I don't think. So how do you manage that?
Well, there's things that you can do by creating networks which don't force you to come all the way into the city to go out again. But the other thing, and that was the point that I was wanting to get to, is how do we actually do new development? I mean, the things that we're developing around our public transport system now are car parks and apartments. They're the two things that we should have least of around the station, really. The density question really is about how do we concentrate destinations rather than how do we concentrate origins. We don't really need to concentrate the way we live. It's where we're going to that we have to concentrate. And so they're the things that we have to build around our public transport network. So if as many of those jobs in the suburbs were in key nodes, then you could concentrate the public transport system around it. And that's the key to planning.
So you want to create more jobs around public transport nodes that are not the CBD? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
Well, we do it by how we plan our schools and we plan our hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got two things going on. We've got people saying you should walk to school because it's healthy. But on the other hand, we've got an education department which concentrates everybody into large schools and encourages people to choose a school a long way away, and then builds those schools in places which are difficult to get to by public transport. So we've got a real counterproductivity going on there. So a whole lot of our planning system has to come together.
So the idea of transport-orientated development, which has been around for a while, has often been that you build housing around stations, but you're saying we should be building schools, hospitals, shopping centres,
and bus interchanges.
And bus interchanges around stations. Okay, others from the panel want to...
I think there was a comment made earlier about thinking about services, and I think this is one of the most important things for us to shift our thinking on. So, and I mean us here, I'm talking VicRoads as much as anything, is to shift our focus from roads and assets to services and livability, and think about our problems in that sort of context rather than developing a pipeline list of projects that need to be, infrastructure projects that need to be developed.
I would add a comment on the issue around development around transport, around train stations, for instance. I don't disagree with you, but there does need to be a residential component to it. So perhaps what we need to look at is, rather than just an apartment block with some shops at the bottom, perhaps that development is mixed use, and perhaps it is some commercial, so you get the jobs and the activities, and there could be apartments within it.
Sure, I'm not saying that you wouldn't ever live there, but that shouldn't be the focus.
No, so that way you do get the mix of the jobs, and people have a choice of working within that area that they live in, or commuting if that's their choice. But I will just throw back to one of the other issues, is that people get in cars for other reasons other than just to get to work. You know, you try having a child at a preschool, a child at primary school, and you've got to pick up the groceries on the way home. It's pretty hard to do that on public transport unless you're Superwoman, and I know lots of us are.
Well, especially if we've planned things so that all those destinations are scattered.
Exactly. So that's a big challenge. And, you know, people are in cars. It's hard to drive a family of 3 children to their sporting activities on a weekend. So hence, this is why adding to the congestion.
That's our starting point right now. I think we need to accept that. However, it doesn't need to be our end destination. There are cities in the world where the scenario you've just described, people actually solve that by bicycle. If you want to, you can build an environment like that. Yeah.
Or the kids are able to use the public transport system on their own. You know, we have, you know, when I come back from Europe, where I've seen so many young people travelling independently, and you talk to parents in Melbourne and they say, I wouldn't dare, you know, I'd be a terrible parent if I did that. That's a real indictment on the way we've constructed our cities.
So is that a generational change where...
No, I don't think it's...
You think it's faster than that?
Well, no, I think it's still... I think it's young people, young parents today are still terrified and have their kids in the... It's just we don't have the safe options that make it possible, and the whole community
and also,
approach to that.
until tram stops are safe, you can understand.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
I mean, until we get accessible and safe tram stops everywhere, getting off in the middle of Brighton Road next to a primary school where my son used to go to primary school, I would be worried about him doing it on his own. Another thing I want to come back to is, look, we'd all love it if there was one big solution, you know, an east-west link or an underground rail tunnel that would solve all our transport woes overnight. But of course, even if we ever built that, it wouldn't be overnight. It's going to take a long time, a lot of planning, billions of dollars. In the meantime, the public transport service that we can most quickly operationalise, I hate that word, but most quickly bring into operation is buses. Do buses actually, and they operate on roads in the outer suburbs, do buses hold the key to managing the short term until we build more rail and things like that?
I think they start that process, and the new government has said they're going to put $100 million a year into new bus services. What they have to not do is to put them into increasing the frequency sort of randomly on bus routes that go around in the suburbs and don't take people anywhere. They need to be using them to construct new networks, and there's a lot of skills around to be able to do that.
Other comments?
I would agree with that. I think buses provide a very scalable solution to the mass people movement challenge. They allow you to get into urban environments without really impinging greatly on the amenity. And not only is it scalable in terms of how many people you're moving, but the actual physical vehicle itself can be scaled up and down as well. You can always put in a bus solution and then replace it with an alternative solution later on. But quite frankly, there's also plenty of locations through the denser inner and middle areas where getting a new tram or a new train is so expensive that a new bus is always going to be a better and more affordable solution.
Now, the argument, of course, will be, yeah, but people don't like buses. They don't use buses. Do you have to build it and then they will come?
The buses in Melbourne are fabulous. They're absolutely fabulous. And
then the vehicle,
are they,
all the routes.
the vehicles and the routes. I've been on trams, I go trains, and I've been on the buses, and I think the buses are far superior than the buses in Sydney. And I used to get a bus to work in Sydney. So I think they're completely underutilised. They're flexible. You can reroute them. They're safe. You've got a driver if you want to put your children on a bus to go to school. Sorry?
No, we'll take questions in a moment. Yeah.
So, they're a great option.
But Melbourne's bus routes, they aren't necessarily all that. Historically, some of them are kind of grandfathered from previous arrangements, and as I understand it, they're not actually very well organised.
Oh no, you don't know where the bus route is.
If you're lucky enough to have a bus route that goes where you want to go, but I mean, I work at Melbourne University, and finally, there's now a bus service that takes you from North Melbourne Station to Melbourne University, and it's going gangbusters. But it's a very odd thing. It doesn't connect you to Lygon Street or across to Eastern Hill to the St Vincent's. So we really, even in the inner city, and we talk about being the inner city public transport rich and the public transport poor of the outer suburbs, you can see in the usage data that our public transport use falls off extremely quickly as you go away from the central city. So we don't have the network in the inner city that supports the public transport use that the demand is there for.
Peter, I contend though in some respects you answered your own question in that buses have an important role to play, but as part of a system. There's some research out of Sydney that looked at how people use buses, how people use trains. People use buses for local and shorter trips and trains for longer trips into larger employment centres. If you look at the way Perth, which is a city which did succeed in expanding its kind of access to public transport, built some new train lines, improved its access off a very low base, but still a step in the right direction. How did they do it? Well, one, they built the train lines in a way that was kind of adapted to the suburban conditions, so stations quite far apart, acknowledging that there would be people travelling in by bus or by car, substantial car parks, but also good bus connections to the train services. And so they've seen uptake of both those kinds of services increase in a way that exceeded expectations and is actually delivering better cost recovery than Melbourne's public transport services do, although that is still pretty low by world standards.
Okay. Thank you to the City of Melbourne, Knowledge Melbourne Program, VicRoads, Department of Economic Development, Jobs and Transport, Future Leaders and Federation Square, and thank you above all to our panellists. Thank you to you for attending.